Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Naica Crystal Caves. In the year 2000, a team of miners boring through the earth beneath the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico broke through a rock wall and stepped into a chamber that no human eye had ever seen. They were digging for lead, silver, and zinc in the Naica mine, following ore veins nearly 1,000 feet below the surface. What they found instead was a room that should not exist, a cavern filled with translucent milky white beams of stone, some jutting from floor to ceiling, some crisscrossing the void like the ribs of some impossible cathedral. These were crystals, and they were the largest ever discovered on Earth. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind. The individual gypsum crystals in the Naica Cave reach lengths of up to 39 feet. That is longer than a school bus. A single crystal, one continuous, flawless geometric shaft, tall enough that a person could lie across it 3 times over and still not reach the end. The miners had not opened a pocket of pretty minerals. They had walked into a forest of mineral spears, each one heavier than a car, each one grown to a size that violates every intuition about what stone is supposed to do. The numbers behind their formation defy comprehension. These crystals did not grow in years or centuries. They grew over roughly 500,000 years, atom by atom, dissolved mineral by dissolved mineral, in water, heated by the magma chamber below. The chamber had been submerged for 500,000 years in mineral-rich water, held at a perfect, unchanging temperature, undisturbed, untouched. Growing in perfect darkness while entire species evolved and vanished on the surface above, the miners had drained that ancient water without knowing it, and in doing so, they had opened a tomb that the planet had spent 5,000 centuries sealing. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely lethal. The Naica Cave is not a place a human body can survive. The air temperature inside sits near 136 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity reaches 99%. In those conditions, moisture condenses inside your lungs faster than your body can expel it. Sweat cannot evaporate. Your internal temperature climbs with nowhere for the heat to go. An unprotected person entering the chamber begins to die within minutes, drowning slowly in the fluid their own body produces, cooking from the inside in an atmosphere that feels less like a cave than the inside of a lung. The scientists who eventually studied the crystals could only enter wearing refrigerated suits packed with ice and breathing chilled air, and even then, only for a handful of minutes at a time. The most beautiful place ever found beneath the earth is also one of the most hostile to human life. Consider what that means. For 500,000 years, this chamber existed in total silence, at a temperature that would kill anything that stumbled into it, growing crystals of impossible size in absolute darkness. No animal ever crossed it. No light ever touched it. No breath was ever drawn inside it. It was a world sealed off completely from the world we know, and it was found not by explorers, not by scientists, not by anyone looking for wonder. It was found by working men chasing metal, who cut through a wall and let the light of their headlamps fall on something that had been waiting in the dark since before our species existed. This is the pattern. Crews digging for ore, following the cold logic of profit into the deep rock, break through a wall, and find a world no human was meant to see. At Naica, that world was made of crystal and heat. But the earth hides stranger things than minerals. Some of the walls that mining crews have broken through were not built by geology at all. They were carved by hands. Number 9. Derinkuyu Underground City. In 1963, a man in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey was renovating his home when he knocked down a wall in his basement. Behind it, he found a passage. Not a cellar, not a forgotten storeroom. A passage that descended into darkness and kept going, deeper than any foundation had any right to reach. What he had breached was not a room, it was a city. Derinkuyu descends roughly 18 stories into the earth. It is a labyrinth of chambers, tunnels, stairwells, and shafts, carved entirely by hand into the soft volcanic tuff that blankets this part of Anatolia. The stone here is a gift and a curse. Soft enough to cut with primitive tools, it hardens on contact with air, sealing the walls of every chamber into permanent form. Whoever dug this place understood the rock intimately. They excavated downward through 18 levels, hollowing out a world beneath the surface world, and then they hid the entrance so completely that it took a collapsing basement wall and the passage of centuries to reveal it. The numbers are staggering. At its full capacity, Derinkuyu could shelter an estimated 20,000 people. Not 20,000 for a night, 20,000 living underground, along with their livestock, their food stores, their wine presses, their wells, and their dead. There were stables carved into the upper levels for animals. There were kitchens with ventilation designed to disperse smoke. There were chapels, storage rooms, and communal spaces threaded together by tunnels so narrow that intruders would have to move single file, bent low, defenseless. And running the full depth of the city, from the surface down through all 18 stories, were ventilation shafts, more than 50 of them, engineered to circulate air into the deepest chambers where no natural light or breath could ever reach. These shafts also served as wells, drawing water from below without ever exposing the inhabitants to the surface. A city could survive down here, sealed off entirely from the world above, breathing through stone. But here's where the architecture begins to tell a darker story. Between each level of Derinkuyu sit massive rolling stone doors, circular slabs of rock, some weighing over 1,000 pounds, mounted to roll across the passageways and seal them shut. These doors have a critical feature. They could only be operated from the inside. A small hole in the center allowed the defenders to see out, and possibly to strike out, while remaining completely sealed against whatever was on the other side. Every feature of Derinkuyu's design points to a single purpose. This was not a city built for daily life. No one carves 18 stories into the earth for convenience. This was a refuge, a place to disappear into when the surface became too dangerous to survive. The rolling doors, the choke point tunnels, the concealed entrances, the self-contained wells and air shafts. The entire structure was engineered around one question: how do we hide, and how do we hold, when something above ground is trying to kill us? We know the city was used by early Christians, who sheltered here during the Roman persecutions, and later during the Arab raids that swept across Anatolia. Thousands of them vanished underground when the horizon filled with soldiers, sealing the stone doors behind them and waiting in the dark. But Derinkuyu is older than the Christians who used it. The excavation is now attributed at least in part to the Phrygians, an Iron Age people who inhabited this land nearly 3,000 years ago. The city was inherited, expanded, and reused across generation after generation, each one adding to the labyrinth their ancestors had already carved. Consider what that means. For thousands of years, the people of Cappadocia lived with an understanding that at any moment, the world above could turn against them so completely that their only option was to descend into the earth and disappear. They did not build this once, in a single panic. They built it continuously, refining it, deepening it, passing it down as a survival system across the collapse of empires. The question is not how Derinkuyu was made. The question is what the people who made it were so afraid of, that they carved an entire city 18 stories into the dark and lined every passage with doors that only lock from within. They left the doors. They did not leave the answer. Number 8. Lascaux Cave. In September 1940, 4 teenagers and a dog wandered the wooded hills above the village of Montignac in southwestern France. The dog, according to the account that has followed the story ever since, had vanished into a hole in the ground. When the boys went looking, they slipped through a narrow opening left by an uprooted tree and lowered themselves into the dark. What they found beneath their feet was not a cave in any ordinary sense. It was a gallery, a cathedral of images painted by hands that had turned to dust 17,000 years before those boys were born. The walls erupted with animals, horses in mid-gallop, aurochs, the massive wild cattle of the Ice Age, rendered in sweeping black outlines that stretched 5 meters across the stone, stags with branching antlers, bison, ibex, and creatures no living eye had ever seen in motion, all captured in ochre, black, and red across dim limestone walls that had not known light for the length of recorded human civilization, and then some. The teenagers stood in a room that predated everything, every empire, every pyramid, every written word. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind, roughly 17,000 years. That is not a span measured against the reigns of kings. It is measured against the retreat of glaciers. When these images were painted, ice sheets still gripped the northern continents. Mammoths still walked the earth. The people who made these paintings lived in a world colder, wilder, and emptier than anything a modern human has experienced. And yet they climbed into the absolute darkness of a cave, carried fire and pigment with them, and produced art of such confidence and precision that it would not be surpassed for tens of thousands of years. But here is where the discovery becomes genuinely unsettling. These paintings had been sealed. For thousands of years, the entrance the boys stumbled through had been closed, the cave hidden and airtight, its contents preserved in a darkness so total that the pigments never faded. No one had walked those chambers since the last artists laid down their tools and left. The images were not degraded relics half erased by time. They were fresh, vivid, immediate, as though the painters had stepped out moments before. The earth had swallowed the room whole and kept it perfectly, waiting for the length of all human history that came after. Consider what that means. The people who painted Lascaux were not primitive. They possessed technique, planning, an understanding of perspective and animal anatomy that professional artists would recognize instantly. They mixed pigments. They built scaffolding to reach the higher walls. They chose their subjects with intent. These were fully modern human minds, thinking, dreaming, believing, working in the flickering dark, and they are gone. Not just dead, erased. We do not know their language, their names, their gods, or what these paintings were for. Were they ritual, instruction, prayer? The answer left the cave with them and never returned. What makes Lascaux particularly haunting is what it implies about everything we cannot see. This was one cave, found by accident, by children and a dog, through a hole opened by a fallen tree. How many other galleries lie sealed beneath the hills of Europe, of Asia, of every continent early humans crossed? How many Ice Age cathedrals remain in the dark, undiscovered, their painters as forgotten as if they had never existed at all? The earth conceals human culture on a scale we have barely begun to measure. The paintings of Lascaux are now sealed again, closed to the public to protect them from the breath and heat of visitors. The artists remain anonymous. The horses still gallop across the stone in the darkness, exactly as they have for 17,000 years, waiting in a silence no one alive can interpret. Number 7. The London Mithraeum. In 1954, workers clearing rubble from a bomb-scarred site in the heart of London struck stone. 9 years after the end of the Second World War, the city was rebuilding itself over its own wounds, digging foundations for the offices and towers that would define its modern skyline. What the construction crew uncovered instead was a temple, not a fragment, not a scattering of Roman brick, a complete sanctuary, buried beneath the pavement of one of the busiest financial districts on Earth. The building was a Mithraeum, a temple dedicated to the god Mithras. And Mithras was no ordinary deity. He belonged to one of the ancient world's most secretive religions, a mystery cult that spread across the Roman Empire in the first centuries of the Common Era and left almost no written records behind. Its followers worshipped underground, in windowless chambers designed to imitate caves, gathering in darkness to enact rituals that outsiders were never permitted to witness. The cult of Mithras was built around secrecy. It survived by leaving nothing for the uninitiated to read. What makes the London discovery so unsettling is not simply that the temple existed, it is where it existed. Beneath the feet of millions of commuters, beneath the traffic and the glass towers and the relentless machinery of modern commerce, an entire religious world had been sealed away and forgotten, not abandoned in some remote wilderness, not lost to the desert or the sea, buried directly under a living metropolis, its stone foundations pressed down by nearly 2,000 years of accumulated city. That is the pattern the earth keeps repeating. It does not erase the past. It layers over it. London had risen century by century on top of Roman Londinium, each generation building higher, laying new streets across the ruins of the old, until the temple, where Roman soldiers once knelt in the dark, lay 18 feet below the modern surface. The people who worshipped there vanished. Their god vanished with them. The stone remained, waiting, patient, until a construction crew clearing bomb damage happened to dig in exactly the right place. The discovery caused a sensation. Crowds queued for hours to glimpse the foundations before the developers could pour their concrete. Here was tangible proof that beneath the world Londoners thought they knew lay another world entirely, a hidden layer of belief and ritual that had thrived and died and left barely a whisper in the historical record. The temple's very presence rewrote the map of the city. It was no longer a modern metropolis. It was a modern metropolis balanced on top of a Roman one, which was itself balanced on older ground still. The Mithraeum was eventually reconstructed, moved, and then returned close to its original position, presented today with atmospheric lighting and drifting mist that attempts to summon the darkness its worshippers once demanded. Visitors descend into an artificial gloom, standing where cultists gathered to enact rites we still do not fully understand. The recreation is deliberate theater, but the stones are real. They carry the weight of a religion that once spanned an empire and now survives only as foundations under an office block. Consider what this means. A complete cult site, an entire chapter of human belief, sat undisturbed beneath one of the most heavily populated places on the planet, discovered only because a bomb had fallen and a crew had come to clear the wreckage. If the Earth can hide a temple beneath modern London, the question becomes unavoidable. What else lies waiting beneath the cities we walk through every single day, and how much deeper does the buried human story go? Number 6. The Cradle of Humankind. About 40 kilometers northwest of Johannesburg, in a stretch of South African grassland riddled with limestone, mining crews chasing lime deposits blasted and quarried their way into the earth throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were after limestone, not history. Lime was valuable, essential for construction and for processing gold from the reefs that had made the region wealthy. So the crews cut into the pale rock, hauled it up, and moved on. What they left exposed in the shattered walls of those workings was something no one was looking for: bone. Ancient bone, calcified into the stone itself, fused into the limestone over spans of time that human minds are not built to hold. The place is called Sterkfontein. It sits at the center of a region now known as the Cradle of Humankind, and the name is not marketing. It is a claim about where we come from, and the fossils pulled from these caves have made that claim nearly impossible to dispute. The limestone at Sterkfontein did not form as an empty quarry waiting to be dug. Over millions of years, rainwater dissolved channels and chambers deep into the rock, opening a hidden underground world of galleries and hollows. Into those chambers, over unimaginable stretches of time, fell the bones of the dead, animals and something more than animals, creatures that walked upright. The dripping, mineral-rich water that carved the caves also entombed what fell into them, sealing bone inside sheets of hardened calcite. Deep limestone chambers layered with calcified bone deposits, a tomb that made fossils without anyone intending to. The miners cracked it open by accident. In 1947, from the breccia of these workings came a skull that would rewrite the story of human origins. A near-complete cranium of an adult, small-brained, clearly not human and yet clearly not ape. It was given the name Mrs. Plez. The fossil belonged to Australopithecus, a genus of upright walking hominins that lived over 2 million years ago, long before anything we would recognize as a person existed. Mrs. Pless was not a missing link in the crude sense the phrase implies. She was evidence, physical and undeniable, that creatures walking on 2 legs, with brains a third the size of ours, had lived and died in these hills in the deep African past. And then, decades later, the caves gave up something even more extraordinary. In the deeper chambers of Sterkfontein, embedded in the rock, lay a skeleton so complete it defied every expectation of what these caves could preserve. It is called Littlefoot. Not a scatter of fragments, not a jaw and a few teeth, but a near-complete hominin skeleton, one of the most complete ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Extracting it took decades of painstaking work, chiseling bone from stone millimeter by millimeter, because the same calcite that preserved Littlefoot had locked the skeleton into the cave wall like an insect in amber. The creature had fallen, or been swept, into the underground dark more than 3 million years ago. The limestone held it there, waiting, through the entire span of human existence, and then some. But here is where the significance of Sterkfontein moves beyond a collection of remarkable fossils. These caves did not add a footnote to the story of human evolution. They reshaped it. The abundance and completeness of the hominins recovered from these South African chambers helped establish that our lineage rose out of Africa, that upright walking came long before large brains, that the family tree of humanity is older and stranger than anyone had assumed. An entire framework for understanding what we are was built on bones that surfaced because men were quarrying lime. Consider what that means. The record of our own origins, the physical evidence of the creatures we descend from, sat sealed in limestone for millions of years, and it entered human knowledge only because commercial mining happened to blast into the right chambers. How much of our own deep past still lies fused in rock, unquarried, unblasted, unknown? The Cradle of Humankind is not a single site. It is a warning about how little we have actually seen. The Earth kept the record of who we are. We stumbled into a fraction of it by chance, chasing something else entirely. Number 6. The Longyou Caves. In 1992, in the village of Xianbeicun in Zhejiang Province, China, a group of villagers decided to solve a mystery that had puzzled their ancestors for generations. There were ponds in their village, deep, dark, still ponds that locals believed were bottomless. No one knew how far down they went. No one had ever reached the bottom. The villagers pooled their money, bought water pumps, and began draining one of the ponds to see what lay beneath. They expected mud, perhaps some fish, perhaps nothing at all. What emerged as the water level dropped was a vast artificial chamber carved into solid sandstone, a cavern so large it defied every assumption about what the ponds had ever been. The village ponds were not natural features. They were the flooded mouths of an enormous man-made complex hidden beneath the surface for an unknown span of centuries. As the pumps continued, the scale became clear. There was not one cavern. There were dozens. To date, at least 24 separate caverns have been identified, hand-carved from the sandstone bedrock, connected by a network that covers tens of thousands of square meters. Some chambers descend to depths approaching 30 meters, the largest span areas comparable to a cathedral, their ceilings supported by massive stone pillars, left deliberately in place by whoever hollowed out the rock around them. Also referred to as the Xianren Caves, the complex represents one of the largest known ancient underground excavations on Earth, carved entirely by human hands. The numbers are difficult to absorb. Archaeologists estimate that nearly 1 million cubic meters of sandstone were removed to create the complex. That is a volume of rock that would require the sustained labor of thousands of workers over years, perhaps decades. Every surface of every chamber is covered in the same distinctive markings, precise parallel chisel lines, cut at consistent angles, running across the walls, the ceilings, and the pillars in uniform bands. The pattern is consistent. From one cavern to the next, across enormous stone surfaces, the same deliberate technique repeats itself with a regularity that suggests either extraordinary coordination or a single unified design. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely impossible. There is no historical record of the Longyou Caves. None. China is a civilization obsessed with documentation. For more than 2,000 years, its dynasties maintained meticulous records of construction projects, tax levies, labor conscriptions, and public works. A project requiring the removal of 1 million cubic meters of stone, a project demanding thousands of laborers and years of coordinated effort, is precisely the kind of undertaking that would appear in an imperial ledger, a local chronicle, a temple inscription, a family history. Something, anything. There is nothing. No text mentions the caves. No legend names the builders. No inscription records the purpose. A complex that ranks among the most ambitious excavation projects in the ancient world was carved into the earth by people who left no trace of who they were, and then it was forgotten so completely that the villagers living directly above it believed the flooded entrances were natural ponds. The truly disturbing aspect is the absence of evidence for something so massive. Where did the removed sandstone go? Nearly 1 million cubic meters of rock had to be carried out of the chambers and deposited somewhere on the surface. A spoil heap of that magnitude would reshape the surrounding landscape. It would be visible for kilometers. Yet no such deposit has ever been identified. The rock was extracted, and then it vanished as thoroughly as the people who cut it. And the purpose of the caves remains unknown. Researchers have proposed that they were quarries, that they were tombs, that they were storehouses, that they were military barracks, that they were palaces built underground for reasons lost to time. Every theory collapses under examination. Quarries do not require finished, polished walls or carefully preserved decorative pillars. Tombs contain remains, and none have been found. Storehouses leave residue, and the chambers are empty. The chisel patterns themselves, so precise, so uniform, so evidently intentional, hint that the surfaces mattered as much as the void they enclosed. Someone wanted these walls to look a certain way, and we have no idea why. How many workers descended into the dark to cut these chambers by hand? How many years did they labor, and under whose command? What did they believe they were building, and what happened to the knowledge of it, so that within a few generations the entrances filled with water, and the whole enterprise dissolved into local myth? The answer remains in the stone. The Longyou Caves sit today exactly where the villagers found them, drained and lit and open to visitors, their chisel-marked walls rising into the darkness above. We can walk through them. We can measure them. We can photograph every mark left by hands that worked here in silence. But we cannot name a single person who lifted a chisel, and we cannot say what any of it was for. Number 4. The salt mines of Hallstatt. High in the Austrian Alps, above a lake so clear it mirrors the mountains, there is a mine that has been swallowing men and preserving them for more than 3,000 years. The Bronze Age salt mines of Hallstatt are among the oldest industrial sites on Earth, worked continuously in some form since before the pyramids were finished. But what makes them extraordinary is not their age, it is what the salt remembers. Salt does not decay, it does not permit rot. The same chemistry that once made this white mineral more valuable than gold also makes it a perfect preservative, halting the slow biological collapse that erases nearly everything from the deep past. In most archaeological sites, wood rots, leather dissolves, fabric disintegrates, and flesh vanishes within decades. In Hallstatt, none of that happened. The salt held everything in place, frozen not by ice but by chemistry, waiting in the dark. The numbers are staggering. Miners here carved wooden staircases dated to roughly 1100 BCE, structures assembled by hands that have been dust for over 3 millennia, still intact, still bearing the marks of the tools that shaped them. Leather sacks used to haul ore, wooden shovels and picks, fragments of clothing woven in patterns that predate every written history of the region, torches, still bearing soot from the last time they were lit, an entire working world, sealed and suspended, exactly as its inhabitants left it. The walls themselves glitter. Crystalline salt catches the beam of a headlamp and throws it back in 1,000 fractured points of light, turning the tunnels into something closer to a cathedral than a mine. The prehistoric miners moved through this shimmering underworld carrying fire, cutting the rock salt loose block by block, hauling it up shafts that descended hundreds of meters into the mountain. They were not passing through. They lived their working lives here, generation after generation, in a place no sunlight has ever touched. But here's where the discovery stops being about tools and starts being about people. In the salt, miners found a body. He is remembered as the man in salt, a prehistoric miner who died deep inside the mountain, perhaps crushed in a collapse, his corpse never recovered by his own people. The salt took him instead. It preserved him the way it preserved the staircases and the sacks and the torches, holding his flesh, his clothing, his final moment of labor across a gulf of time that dwarfs the entire span of recorded civilization. When later miners uncovered him, they were not looking at a skeleton, they were looking at a man. Consider what that means. The people who built this mining culture left no writing. They recorded no names, no beliefs, no accounting of who they were or what they thought about the mountain that fed and finally killed them. Everything we know of them, we know because the salt refused to let them disappear. The tools they held, the clothes they wore, the wooden steps they climbed each morning, the body of one man who never climbed back out. This is a real prehistoric mining culture, remarkably preserved, not through monuments or inscriptions, but through the accident of what they chose to dig for. They came for salt. The salt kept them. Most lost worlds leave behind stone and silence. Hallstatt left behind the workers themselves, their hands, their labor, their death, held in perfect suspension beneath a lake in the Alps. The miners became the artifacts, and somewhere in the glittering dark of that mountain, the past is not buried. It is preserved, waiting, exactly as it was on the day the salt closed over it. In Hallstatt, the dead did not decay into mystery, they stayed, which raises a question few other sites can force us to ask. What does it mean to look directly into the face of someone who died before history began? Number 3. The Grotte du Tuc. In 2000, a caver squeezing through a narrow passage in the Dordogne region of southwestern France emerged into a chamber that no human had entered in roughly 25,000 years. He was not searching for anything in particular. He was doing what cavers do, following the darkness inward, testing the limits of the passage. Then his light fell on the walls, and everything changed. The walls were covered in engravings, not scratches, not random marks, deliberate figures, etched into the stone by hands that had been dust for 250 centuries. Mammoths, bison, horses, rhinoceros, long-necked birds rendered in confident, sweeping lines by artists who understood their subjects intimately. The engravings stretch across hundreds of meters of cave wall, an underground gallery assembled in the deep Paleolithic, when Europe was locked in ice and humanity was a scattering of hunter-gatherer bands clinging to survival. But here is where the Grotte du Tuc separates itself from every other decorated cave in France. It was not only a gallery, it was a tomb. Deep within the chamber, in hollows that had once been dug and used by hibernating cave bears, researchers found human remains, not scattered, not accidental, placed. The bodies of at least 6 individuals had been deliberately arranged in the depressions bears had left in the cave floor, tens of thousands of years earlier. Someone had carried the dead into the darkness, past the engraved animals, and laid them to rest in the beds of predators long gone. Consider what that required. These were people without written language, without metal, without agriculture, and yet they entered a lightless cave carrying torches, and their dead navigated hundreds of meters of narrow passage, and performed a burial ritual so deliberate that it survives as intentional across a gulf of 25,000 years. The bone deposits in the bare hollows are among the oldest evidence anywhere of humans intentionally burying their dead inside a decorated cave. Art and death, sealed together in a single chamber. What makes the Grotte du Tuc particularly haunting is the relationship between the two. The engravings and the burials were not separate events by separate peoples. They belonged to the same cultural moment, the same community of minds. Whoever carved the mammoths on the walls also chose this place as the resting ground for their dead. The animals were not decoration. They were companions to the departed, watching over the burials in a darkness that no living eye was meant to see again. We do not know what they believed. We do not know why the dead were placed in the beds of bears, or what the engraved animals meant to the people who made them, or whether the cave was a sanctuary, a threshold, or something for which we have no word. The people who carried out these rituals left no explanation. They left only the marks on the stone and the bones in the hollows, arranged with a care that speaks of grief and meaning we can feel but cannot translate. For 25,000 years, the chamber held its dead and its animals in perfect darkness. No sunlight, no witness, no sound but the slow work of water on stone. An entire spiritual world, complete with its own art and its own funerary rites, sealed beneath the earth of France until a single caver, following the passage inward, stumbled into a room where the Ice Age had never ended. The Grotte du Tuc is now protected, sealed again, its treasures too fragile to expose. It waits in the dark, as it has always waited, holding its dead among the painted beasts. Number 9. The Silver Mines of Laurion. In the hills of Attica, roughly 50 kilometers southeast of Athens, the earth was hollowed out over centuries, into a labyrinth so vast and so brutal that it would ultimately decide the fate of Western civilization. The silver mines of Laurion were among the most extensively worked deposits in the ancient world, exploited across generations by a state that understood exactly what lay beneath the rock. Not decoration, not ritual, wealth, and with wealth, power. The scale of the operation defies the pastoral image most people carry of ancient Greece. The mines of Laurion consisted of networks of narrow shafts and galleries dug entirely by hand, descending through solid limestone toward veins of silver-bearing ore. These were not the grand tunnels of engineering pride. They were cramped, suffocating passages, many barely large enough for a single human body to crawl through. Miners worked in near-total darkness, breathing dust, hunched or prone, chipping at the rock with iron tools by the flickering light of small oil lamps that consumed the little air that remained. The labor that carved these tunnels was almost entirely enslaved. Tens of thousands of enslaved people were forced into the shafts of Laurion, worked in shifts that pushed the limits of human endurance. They descended into passages where the ceiling pressed against their backs, where the temperature climbed, where a collapse or a lamp gone dark meant a death no one would record. They did not carve art. They did not bury their dead in sacred hollows. They dug because they were made to dig, and when they died, the mines simply absorbed them, and the work continued. And here is where the human cost becomes something more than tragedy. It becomes history. The silver these enslaved laborers tore from the earth funded the Athenian navy. In the early 5th century BC, a rich new vein was struck at Laurion, and Athens faced a choice about what to do with the sudden windfall. The city chose warships. 200 triremes were built on the strength of Laurion silver, a fleet that would meet the Persian Empire at the Battle of Salamis. That fleet held. The invasion broke against it. The democracy that produced philosophy, drama, and the architecture of Western political thought survived because men who would never share in its freedoms were driven into holes in the ground to dig out the metal that paid for its ships. The truly unsettling aspect is the completeness of the exchange. Every silver coin that flowed through the Athenian treasury, every warship that guarded the Aegean, every marble column raised on the Acropolis, carried within it the labor of people whose names were never written down, whose bodies were spent in tunnels too small to stand in. The evidence remains, patient and undeniable, on the surface above those shafts. The ore-processing washing tables of Laurion are still visible today, carved stone platforms where crushed rock was rinsed with water to separate the precious metal from the waste. The channels are still there, the basins are still there, the grooves worn by the flow of water and the grinding of ore have survived 24 centuries of weather and neglect, a physical record of an industrial process that consumed human lives on a staggering scale. Walk among them now, and the silence is total. The shafts descend into darkness beneath your feet, empty, forgotten. The men who dug them, gone without memorial. What Laurion proves is that the foundations of the ancient world were not only made of marble and ideas. They were dug by hand, in the dark, by people whose only monument is the tunnel that killed them. Number 1. Ötzi and the Copper Age. In September of 1991, 2 hikers crossing a glacier high in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy spotted something dark and leathery emerging from the melting ice. They assumed it was a mountaineer who had died in some recent accident. It was not. The body was more than 5,000 years old, and it would rewrite the history of an entire era of human technology. He is called Ötzi, named for the mountains that entombed him. A naturally mummified man, frozen and preserved by the glacier for over 5 millennia, discovered not by a mining crew or an archaeological expedition, but by chance, by 2 people on a walk who happened to pass a body as the ice released its grip. His skin, his organs, his stomach contents, the tattoos etched across his aging joints, all of it survived. He is the oldest well-preserved human body ever found in Europe, and he did not arrive alone. Beside the body lay his equipment, frozen where it fell: a bow, a quiver of arrows, a dagger of flint, clothing of woven grass and stitched hide. But one object among his possessions changed everything. Ötzi carried a copper axe. The axe was not decorative. It was a functional tool, a blade of nearly pure copper hafted to a U-handle, and its presence on the body of a man who died over 5,000 years ago forced a fundamental revision of the timeline. Copper metallurgy in the Alpine region was thought to have arrived later, spread thinner, developed slower. The axe said otherwise. Here was proof, held in a dead man's hand, that Copper Age technology was already circulating through these mountains at a scale no one had assumed. But here is where a single frozen body becomes something far larger than itself. Analysis of the copper in Ötzi's axe revealed that the metal did not come from the mountains where he died. Its chemical signature traced back to ore sources in central Italy, hundreds of kilometers away. The copper had traveled. It had been mined, smelted, worked, and carried across a network of trade and exchange that no written record describes and no monument commemorates. A single axe blade, chemically fingerprinted, exposed the outline of an entire economy. Someone dug that copper out of the earth. Someone extracted the ore. Someone built the furnaces that separated metal from rock. Someone shaped the blade and moved it along routes that crossed valleys and passes and territories. The mining networks of the Copper Age, invisible in the historical record, suddenly had a witness. Ötzi did not build those networks. He was a customer, and his purchase, frozen with him for 5,000 years, revealed the existence of the miners, the smelters, and the traders who made his axe possible. This is the quiet power of what lies beneath the ice and the earth. One body unlocked an entire era of technology, not through a grand ruin, not through a buried city, but through a single dead man carrying a single tool that should not have existed as early as it did. The copper axe of Ötzi is now understood as one of the most important artifacts in European prehistory, precisely because it revealed the invisible, the mines, the trade, the metallurgical knowledge of a people who left almost nothing else behind. And that is the thread running through everything the Earth has surrendered. The crystal caverns and the carved cities, the painted walls and the fossil chambers, the salt-preserved miners and the silver tunnels that funded empires. Every one of them was hidden. Every one of them was found by accident, or by melting ice, or by a wall knocked down in someone's basement. The worlds beneath us are not lost because we forgot them. They are lost because the Earth swallowed them whole, and only chance returns them to the light. Ötzi now rests in a refrigerated chamber in a museum in Bolzano, held at the same temperature as the glacier that kept him for 5,000 years. His axe sits beside him. And somewhere in the mountains he crossed on his final journey, the mines that produced its copper remain unmarked, unexcavated, their diggers gone, their names erased, their labor known only because one man died in the snow and carried the evidence with him into the ice. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.